It was in the hushed rooms of London's high society that her name first became a shadow, a whisper carried on cigar smoke and the rustle of silk gowns. Enid Lindeman, known in time by a darker title, Lady Kilmore, sat among them, her gaze steady, her laughter like a knife hidden in velvet. Men desired her, women watched her, and fate seemed to follow at her heel with a patience both cruel and inevitable. 4 husbands she would wed, 4 men of wealth and stature, and 4 coffins would descend into the earth, leaving behind rumors that did not rest as quietly as the dead. To this day, her story lingers, not as a neat biography, but as an unfinished riddle written in perfume and scandal, echoing in the long corridors of time. Welcome, my listener, wherever you are and whenever this tale finds you. I invite you to share below when and where you are listening, so that together we weave a living tapestry across places and generations. And if you feel the warmth of these stories and wish them to continue, I encourage you to subscribe, to join this circle of remembrance. Before we begin, she was born far from the marble halls of Britain and the salons of Paris, far too from the echo of orchestras that later carried her name between glasses raised in admiration or suspicion. Enid Lindeman first opened her eyes in Australia in the year 1892, beneath skies that seemed endless, pale and bright, where the sea rolled against the coast like a restless god. Her father, Charles Lindeman, was of a family already marked by fortune, tied to vineyards and the slow, patient wealth of the land. It was not a place without comfort, yet it was a place that could not hold her spirit. One imagines the young Enid moving through the verandas and gardens of her childhood with a sense of impatience, her gaze too often turned toward the horizon, her step too quick for the steady rhythm of colonial life. There was already in her the spark of restlessness, a desire for more than what the familiar sun and soil could provide. Those who knew her in those early years spoke of her beauty, though beauty in itself is only a kind of surface veil. Her true gift was a presence that filled a room, a confidence rare in girls of her age. She was tall, striking, with eyes that held both warmth and calculation, and she carried herself with an ease that unsettled as much as it charmed. Some said she seemed older than her years, as if born with an awareness of how short a moment youth could be. In that awareness, she moved quickly, taking from life before life could take from her. Yet one wonders, as one often must, whether such poise was natural or born from a quiet loneliness, a need to command attention before being forgotten. As she grew, the world beyond Australia called to her. The late 19th century was giving way to the 20th, and the pace of life was quickening, drawing the ambitious toward the great cities of Europe. For women, paths were narrower, expectations heavier, yet Enid, in the stories told of her, seemed never bound by the limits others imagined. Her early friendships, her laughter at dances, her sharpness in conversation, all pointed to a girl who knew instinctively that charm could be armor, and wit could open doors barred by wealth or birth. She was restless, perhaps even reckless, yet always deliberate in how she carried herself. To those who met her, she gave the impression not of a girl in search of destiny, but of one who already believed destiny was waiting for her, somewhere beyond the sea. The decision to leave, when it came, might have appeared sudden, but it was surely the culmination of years of longing. Imagine her on the deck of a ship, the wind tearing strands of hair loose as she looked back at the receding shoreline of her homeland. Behind her, the comfortable weight of family and familiarity. Before her, the uncertain promise of adventure. Did she feel sorrow in that moment, or only relief? Did she whisper farewell to Australia, or did she turn her face deliberately away, as if erasing the land from which she came? We cannot know, but perhaps both things were true. For the sea, like life, holds room for contradiction. Her first steps into the wider world led her into circles where charm and beauty were currency, and where wealth magnified both temptation and danger. She would not be long in this new society before she was noticed. Enid Lindeman, though still so young, carried herself with a confidence that made introductions unnecessary. She was not the sort of woman one overlooked. Men of means turned their heads, women of standing looked her over with caution, and so it was not long before she was drawn into her first great entanglement, a marriage that would carry her from the shores of Australia to the salons of the Old World. His name was Rodrik Cameron, heir to a shipping fortune. Wealthy, cultured, and in his own way vulnerable, he encountered Enid at the very moment when her hunger for the world was at its sharpest. Their meeting was swift, their connection sudden, as though two flames had found the same gust of wind. He offered her entrance into a sphere of privilege, and she offered him what he perhaps had lacked: vitality, daring, a spirit that made him feel younger, stronger, more alive. To those who observed them, the match seemed natural, even if accelerated. Was it love or calculation? The truth may rest somewhere between, for Enid was capable of both and rarely surrendered one for the other. Their marriage, though brief, was marked by the glitter of promise. Travel, parties, fine houses, the scent of flowers brought in daily to fill drawing rooms where guests lingered over glasses of wine. Yet beneath the surface, shadows grew. Rodrik Cameron had long been given to drink, and the bottle whispered to him more intimately than even Enid could. His health faltered, his spirit dimmed. Enid, still so young, found herself watching a man age too quickly, dissolve too easily, his fortune a wall that could not defend against his own decline. She remained, but whether out of loyalty or necessity is difficult to say. Perhaps she saw in his weakness a mirror of the fragility that surrounded her, a reminder that wealth was no guarantee against loss. Or perhaps she saw only the narrowing of a path she had hoped would widen. In time, Rodrik Cameron succumbed to his own habits, his life cut short not by malice, but by the slow poison he had chosen himself. For Enid, it was her first brush with the widow's veil, the first moment when whispers might have turned toward her, but did not yet linger. She was young still, her beauty unspent, her reputation intact. But as she stood beside his coffin, the scent of lilies thick in the air, one wonders what passed through her mind. Did she feel grief or only release? Did she fear what others might say? Or did she already know that his death would not be the last to mark her story? The chapter closed, but the story only deepened. A widow before her life had properly begun, Enid Lindeman looked once more toward the horizon, her gaze steady, her resolve unbroken. Whatever sorrow lingered, it did not anchor her long. The world remained open, and she was not one to remain still. The scent of tobacco smoke, once heavy in Rodrik's rooms, faded into air, leaving only memory and the promise of what lay beyond. The scent of tobacco smoke that had once clung to the rooms of Rodrik Cameron lingered still in memory, faint yet insistent, curling into the folds of her new life as though reluctant to disperse. Smoke has a way of attaching itself even long after the fire has burned out, and so too did the remnants of Enid's first marriage follow her into the next. She was a widow now, young and striking, a woman of fortune and freedom in a society that often sought to guard such things closely. For some, widowhood was a shroud, a sign of misfortune that bound them to mourning clothes and withdrawn silences. But for Enid, widowhood became a kind of key. With one chapter closed, she stepped into another, not as the grieving girl she might have been, but as a woman who understood that loss could be transformed into possibility. It was in this new season of her life that she met Brigadier General Frederick Caendish. He was of noble stock, a man whose name carried with it centuries of lineage and respect. Tall, stern, with the air of command, born both from heritage and the battlefield, he embodied a kind of authority that drew admiration from his peers and deference from those beneath him. Yet with Enid something shifted. She, who had already learned how to walk unafraid among the powerful, regarded him not as a figure to be revered, but as a man to be engaged, even perhaps to be tested. Their encounter was charged not with the innocence of youthful attraction, but with the weight of mutual recognition. He, accustomed to admiration, and she, accustomed to offering only what she chose. The courtship, if it can be called such, was brisk. Enid was never one to linger in hesitation, and Frederick Cavendish, with his decisive soldier's nature, matched her pace. Their marriage soon followed, celebrated with a grandeur fitting their station. To those in society, it appeared a match that bound colonial wealth to aristocratic pedigree, a union of fortune and title, the very fabric upon which British high society prided itself. Yet beneath the gilded surface, as with all things in Enid's life, complexity stirred. She entered this marriage not as a naive girl, but as a widow already marked by loss, already aware of how swiftly promises could dissolve. Perhaps it gave her an edge of detachment, or perhaps it sharpened her hunger for all that life might still yield. Their home together reflected both tradition and aspiration. Cavendish, with his soldier's precision, kept his life ordered, disciplined, his habits nearly ritual. Enid, by contrast, brought with her a sense of daring, of movement, of unpredictable charm that disturbed as much as it delighted. Guests who visited spoke of evenings that began with rigid formality, but, under Enid's influence, loosened into laughter and warmth. She had a way of softening edges, of bending even the sternness of her husband into moments of levity. Yet there was tension, too, for discipline and desire do not always sit easily together. He valued decorum. She valued freedom. He respected duty. She pursued pleasure. Their bond was thus a curious one, both complementary and volatile, marked by affection yet shadowed by difference. It was not long before illness touched their lives. Frederick Cavendish, strong and formidable in appearance, began to falter. The details are shrouded, as so often in these stories, in a haze of half-remembered accounts and whispered suggestions. Some said it was pneumonia, others spoke of complications from old injuries, still others hinted at something more mysterious, more deliberate. What is certain is that his decline was sudden and his end swift. Enid, scarcely past her youth, found herself for the second time at the side of a dying husband. The echo of grief already familiar, though the circumstances new. Death came, as it always does, with a quiet finality, leaving her once again a widow, her hands unadorned save for rings that now seemed like relics. But if the first widowhood had been greeted with sympathy, the second raised questions. Two wealthy men, both dead before their time, both leaving behind not only estates, but also the woman who had shared their lives, too briefly to grow old with them. Society, ever eager for stories that explain what cannot be explained, began to whisper. Was she cursed? Was she reckless in her care? Or, though few dared to say it openly, was there something more deliberate in the pattern, something beyond coincidence? These murmurs, carried in the drawing rooms of London and the hunting lodges of the countryside, began to form the early shadow of a reputation that would follow her ever after. A woman of striking beauty, always a widow, always at the side of wealth, always left behind with both grief and gain. It was enough to stir unease. Yet Enid herself seemed untroubled by these whispers. Or perhaps she learned to wear untroubledness as a mask. She continued to move with elegance, to speak with wit, to host gatherings where conversation lingered long into the night. If she felt the sting of suspicion, she did not let it bend her stride. It may be that she regarded such talk as the price of living as she wished, Or perhaps she sensed, even then, that scandal could become its own form of power, shaping how others approached her, creating a distance that she might control. For what is more dangerous in society than a woman whose reputation is uncertain, whose presence cannot be neatly categorized? Still, one cannot help but wonder what silence filled her private hours. When she was alone, did she dwell on the frailty of her husbands, on the fragility of the futures they had promised her? Did she look in the mirror and ask herself what fate she carried, or did she refuse such questions altogether, choosing instead to press forward always toward the next horizon? The truth lies somewhere hidden, as truth so often does, beneath the layers of story and speculation that others wove around her. The second coffin was lowered into the earth, the second farewell spoken, the second chapter of widowhood begun. The marble hallway of their home stood empty, footsteps echoing softly in spaces where once laughter and music had lingered. She was alone again, but not diminished. If anything, she emerged from the loss more formidable, more certain of her place in a world that seemed both eager to doubt her and unable to resist her. She had seen how quickly life could unravel, and perhaps it only deepened her resolve to take what it offered without hesitation. And so the echo of footsteps remained, faint and retreating, marking the end of one path and the beginning of another. For Enid Lindeman, the journey was far from over. The marble hallway gave way to the flicker of candlelight, ancient symbols dancing in the shadows, as destiny carried her toward a man whose name was forever linked with death and immortality. The candlelight flickered across carved stone, illuminating the faint outlines of ancient hieroglyphs, their meaning half known, half lost, as if whispering from a world that had never truly died. In that light, one can imagine Enid Lindeman's gaze, fixed and steady, reflecting not only curiosity but also a kind of recognition, as though she understood that all things, wealth, beauty, reputation, were bound by the same fragile thread as those pharaohs entombed in silence. It was in this world of fascination with the ancient, where mortality and immortality entwined, that she came close to Lord Carnarvin, the man whose name was forever tied to the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. Carnarvin was wealthy, cultured, a man drawn to adventure, and, like many of his peers, susceptible to the allure of women who carried within them the suggestion of danger. He had financed Howard Carter's great discovery in the Valley of the Kings, and thus his name, once merely aristocratic, became forever linked with legend and curse. The opening of the boy king's tomb in 1922 had filled newspapers with both wonder and dread, for soon after, Carnarvin himself fell ill and died, feeding the whispers of a pharaoh's curse. And into this space of rumor and fascination stepped Enid, whose beauty and reputation already carried a shadow of the uncanny. There were murmurs of an affair, of long conversations beneath the desert night sky, of glances exchanged in drawing rooms where others dared not intrude. Whether these tales are truth or merely invention, they have woven themselves into the tapestry of her life so tightly that they can no longer be separated. To think of her at Carnarvin's side is to imagine two figures already brushed by death, already made myth by the stories that trailed them. For him, the tomb and its curse. For her, the widow's veil that seemed to settle too often on her shoulders. Together, they embodied fascination with mortality, the strange attraction of danger, and the unspoken desire to cheat time itself. Did she love him, or was he simply another flame she allowed herself to draw close to? Did he see in her a reflection of the same death shadow that followed him from Egypt? We cannot know, though perhaps the allure lay precisely in that ambiguity. And yet, for all the whispers that tied her to Carnarvin, he would not be her next husband. Death claimed him too swiftly, leaving only the faint perfume of speculation, the flicker of candlelight upon stone walls, and the enduring mystery of a curse. Enid remained, untouched, yet again, and as the world moved on from the fascination of the tomb, so too did she. From the desert sands and the gilded coffins of Egypt, her path wound back into the salons of Britain, where her beauty and daring were still currency, where her presence still unsettled and fascinated in equal measure. It was there that she encountered Marmaduke Furness, known as Duke, one of the richest men in Britain, heir to a vast fortune built upon shipping, industry, and relentless ambition. He was powerful, charismatic, and restless, much like Enid herself. In Duke, she found not only immense wealth, but also a man whose appetites matched her own, whose taste for extravagance and risk mirrored her hunger for life, lived at its fullest edge. Their connection was immediate, a meeting of two forces equally unwilling to settle into the quiet expectations of society. If her first marriage had been marked by youthful promise and decline, and her second by authority and suspicion, this third was ablaze with glamour, audacity, and sheer scale. Their union unfolded in spectacle. They raced yachts across waters that gleamed with sun and salt, their vessels slicing through waves as though to prove mastery not only over the sea, but over time itself. They filled houses with guests, musicians, and laughter, the air heavy with the scent of roses and champagne. Society watched them with fascination and envy, whispering of their extravagance, their affairs, their unashamed defiance of convention. Enid, now the Marchioness of Furness, had reached a pinnacle of power. She was not merely a guest in high society, she was its center, its scandal, its constant topic of conversation. Some admired her boldness, others detested her disregard for propriety, but none could ignore her. And yet, as with all chapters in her life, shadows gathered. Duke Furness, despite his vitality, carried within him the same frailties as the men before. His health declined, whether from illness, indulgence, or the relentless pace of their lives together. The pattern began to repeat itself. The brilliance of wealth and pleasure, the sudden turn towards sickness, the silence of death. And when Furness passed, Enid stood once more at the edge of a grave, a widow for the third time. Her name now weighted with far more than coincidence. 3 husbands gone, each wealthy, each powerful, each leaving her richer still, and each death clouded by whispers that refused to disperse. It was in this moment that society sharpened its epithet. Lady Kilmore, they called her, at first in jest, then in suspicion, then with a certainty that no evidence could ever truly justify, but no rumor could erase. The name clung to her like the tobacco smoke of her first husband's rooms, like the candle smoke of Egyptian tombs, like the smoke of racing yachts burning fuel upon open seas. She had become not only a woman, but a legend, not only a figure in salons, but a warning spoken in lowered voices. And yet she seemed to embrace it, or at least to refuse it the power to diminish her. She continued to live, to love, to command attention, as if scandal itself had become her chosen garment. But even legends are human. In her private hours, did she feel the weight of this name, this shadow that stretched further than her own beauty, her own charm? Did she ever wonder whether the pattern of deaths was coincidence, fate, or something darker that followed her unseen? Or did she, as some believed, simply dismiss such questions, refusing to let them interfere with her pursuit of life at its most vivid? History offers us no certain answer. What it leaves us instead is a trail of impressions. The sound of champagne poured too quickly, the echo of laughter in rooms too swiftly emptied, the flicker of light on hieroglyphs, and the hollow silence that follows the fall of soil upon a coffin. From this silence she emerged again, still luminous, still untouchable, yet carrying within her the reputation that would define her forever. Lady Kilmore, Enid Lindeman, was no longer merely a widow. She was a riddle, a scandal, a figure both feared and desired. The image of champagne glasses set down too quickly lingered in the air, unresolved, marking the close of one chapter and the beginning of the next, where mirrors would reflect not only her beauty, but the shadow of her name. The mirror reflected her face, half in light, half in shadow, as though it too could not decide whether she was a woman of fortune or misfortune, of desire or danger. Enid Lindeman, now widowed 3 times, bore the weight of her reputation with the same ease with which she wore pearls around her throat. She understood that society's gaze was never fixed, that admiration and suspicion were 2 sides of the same coin, and that the reflection one saw was always shaped by the eye of the beholder. In the mirror she found not judgment, but possibility, and perhaps even a secret companion, for who else could hold her gaze so steadily and return it with such silent honesty? It was during these years that her life, already marked by wealth and death, became ever more entangled with scandal. Freed from the constraints of convention by widowhood and emboldened by her own charisma, she began to move through society with a daring that startled and fascinated in equal measure. She took lovers openly, not always discreetly, defying the unwritten rules that women of her class were expected to follow. Among them were men of influence, men whose names carried power, men who risked their own reputations to be near her. She did not bend to secrecy, nor did she shrink from the murmurs that followed. Instead, she seemed to thrive on them, as though every whisper only heightened her allure. One of the most notable of these affairs was with Lord Carnarvin, whose name still lingered, like incense, over the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. Though he had died years earlier, the tales of their connection endured, embroidered by those who found in it a symmetry too perfect to resist. The woman rumored to bring death, and the man forever remembered for unlocking a tomb, said to be cursed. Whether their intimacy was real or imagined, it joined the growing mythology that wrapped itself around Enid, a mythology she neither confirmed nor denied, allowing it to spread like ivy along the walls of her legend. For her silence was not an absence, but a form of power, a way of shaping the stories without ever speaking a word. Beyond Carnarvin, there were others, men whose names never reached the same historical heights, but whose entanglements with Enid left behind the same lingering question. Did she seek love or amusement or power? Did she fall into these connections out of longing, or did she choose them as carefully as one selects jewels for an evening? Again, history does not yield certainty, only fragments of letters, glances caught in photographs, the recollections of others colored by envy or awe. Yet what emerges from these fragments is an image of a woman who refused to be contained, who saw in desire not a shame to be hidden, but a current to be embraced. Her defiance unsettled, for in that world a man's indiscretions could be overlooked, even admired, but a woman's freedom was a danger, a disruption to the fragile balance of appearances. And Enid was not content merely to participate quietly. She danced at the center of it, dazzling and unapologetic, leaving others to wrestle with their discomfort. Some admired her courage, others condemned her recklessness, but all spoke of her. She'd become a figure who could not be ignored, who drew attention as naturally as fire draws the gaze of those gathered around it. There was, too, an extravagance to her way of living that magnified every whisper. Her clothes, her jewels, her manner of entertaining, all bespoke not only wealth, but also a refusal to be modest. At her dinners, the air was thick with perfume and laughter, the sound of glasses ringing against one another, the soft slide of silk gowns across polished floors. And always, at the center of it, was Enid, her smile bright, her voice carrying through the room like a melody both charming and dangerous. She gave the impression of effortlessness, though perhaps it was the result of a careful performance, a performance that demanded constant vigilance. For to dazzle is to risk dimming, and she seemed determined never to let the light falter. And yet, as with all brilliance, shadows followed. The deaths of her husbands had already planted seeds of doubt, and her affairs nourished them. People wondered aloud whether her lovers risked more than scandal in her company, whether charm might conceal a sharper edge. "Lady Kilmore," they repeated, sometimes with a laugh, sometimes with a frown, but always with a trace of unease. It was a name that grew larger than the woman herself, attaching to her every gesture, every glance, every story told in her presence. To be called such a thing is to live as both myth and person, and perhaps even Enid herself wondered in quiet moments where the boundary lay between truth and invention. The mirror, in those moments, may have offered its own cruel clarity, for in reflection, beauty remained untouched, but behind it, time advanced without pause. She was still young, still vibrant, yet the years ahead could not be ignored. Affairs, jewels, laughter, scandal, all these things were bright, but bright things fade. Did she look at herself and see the beginnings of age, or did she choose to see only the light, only the possibility of yet another conquest, another chapter, another chance to remain unforgotten? Mirrors, after all, do not lie, but they also do not speak. Their truth is silent, and silence can be filled with whatever meaning the heart demands. And so she continued, neither denying nor embracing the title society had given her, but wearing it as one wears a garment one did not choose, yet finds impossible to remove. She was Lady Kilmore, the widow, the lover, the scandal, the woman who seemed always at the center of death and desire. To some, she was dangerous. To others, irresistible. To herself, perhaps, she was simply free, unwilling to live within the confines that bound so many others. Freedom, however, is never without cost, and its price is often measured in solitude, in whispers, in the weight of names that can never be cast aside. As the mirror caught her image, the ballroom music drifted faintly through an open window, carrying with it the sounds of a world still eager to watch her, still eager to judge, still eager to be drawn into her orbit. The music was distant, yet insistent, like the beating of a heart that refuses to quiet. It filled the night air, unresolved, promising both joy and danger, as though inviting her to step once more into its rhythm, to dance again beneath the watchful eyes of a society that could not decide whether to love her or to fear her. The distant music drifted still through the open window, a soft rhythm carried by night air, and it seemed to call her onward, away from mirrors and whispers, into yet another chapter of her restless life. Music is both invitation and illusion, a promise that the dance may continue even as the musicians tire, and for Enid Lindeman, it was always the call of the next room, the next stage, the next man who might match her hunger for life. So it was that she came to Viscount Waldorf Astor, heir to one of the greatest fortunes of Britain, master of Cliveden, and a man whose name was already inscribed in the history of politics and society. With him, she would not only marry wealth, but step into the heart of influence, into the corridors where power itself seemed to breathe. Cliveden, their great estate by the Thames, was more than a home. It was a kingdom of its own, a house that carried within its walls the echoes of centuries. High ceilings and sweeping staircases, gardens that stretched like green seas toward the horizon, rooms filled with portraits of ancestors whose eyes watched silently from gilded frames. It was here that Enid, now Lady Astor, walked with a grace that made the house itself seem to bend toward her. She adorned its halls not with hesitation but with certainty, as though she had always belonged there, as though the estate had only awaited her arrival to feel complete. Guests who came to Cliveden found themselves not merely entertained, but enveloped in a world of brilliance, where the air seemed charged with laughter, debate, and the faint scent of roses carried in from the gardens. Waldorf Astor was no ordinary husband. He was both politician and aristocrat, a man of principle and ambition, one whose family name alone commanded respect. Yet he was also, by some accounts, softer than the men Enid had married before, less drawn to indulgence and more to responsibility. In him, she encountered a different kind of power, one not worn like jewelry or paraded on yachts, but woven into the fabric of governance and lineage. Their marriage was less a whirlwind than a coronation, less passion than establishment, but in its grandeur, it offered Enid what she had always sought, a place at the very heart of British society, not as a guest, but as its mistress. The years at Cliveden were a mixture of splendor and scrutiny. The estate became a gathering place for the influential and the curious, for politicians, writers, and artists who came to bask in the peculiar blend of opulence and vitality that the Astors provided. Enid, with her luminous charm, presided over these gatherings with the ease of a queen, drawing even the most rigid figures into her orbit. Her wit could disarm, her beauty could soften, her laughter could ease the weight of politics into something resembling joy. And yet, always, there lingered that other name, whispered even in these exalted halls, Lady Kilmore. It clung to her no matter how high she climbed, no matter how securely she sat beside Waldorf. Death had followed her into Cliveden, if not yet to him, then to those whose names her own life had already written in shadow. Society was fascinated by the paradox. Here was a woman once condemned by whispers, now mistress of one of the grandest houses in Britain. Here was scandal transformed into spectacle, suspicion into fascination. Enid did not erase her past. How could she? But instead carried it with her, allowing it to add depth to her presence, as though each rumor were another jewel strung upon the necklace she wore. She understood, perhaps more keenly than any of her peers, that reputation could not always be destroyed, but it could be repurposed, turned from a weapon against her into a kind of crown. Lady Kilmore entered Cliveden not as an intruder, but as an inevitability, and in that inevitability she seemed untouchable. But beneath the gilded evenings and the polished gardens lay questions no less sharp than before. Did Waldorf Astor, in the private chambers of Cliveden, trust her fully, or did he too hear the whispers that followed her? Did he see her as redemption, or as danger beautifully disguised? History records no confessions, only the surface of their union, a marriage that seemed steady, a household that thrived, a society that continued to watch with mingled admiration and unease. Perhaps he, more than the others, understood that Enid was less a danger to his life than to convention itself, less destroyer than disruptor, a woman unwilling to live in the shadow of expectation. And perhaps it was precisely that quality that drew him. For what is power without the presence of someone who dares it to live boldly? In these years, Enid also found herself at the heart of political and cultural currents. The Astors were not merely wealthy, but influential, and Cliveden became a stage upon which ideas were exchanged, alliances considered, futures debated. Enid, though not a politician, held her own in these circles, her voice carrying with it both intelligence and the audacity to speak where women were often expected to remain silent. She was not content to be decoration. She was participation, presence, assertion. And yet she never abandoned her other qualities: the charm, the beauty, the ability to disarm with a glance or enchant with a smile. In her, frivolity and seriousness intertwined. confusing those who sought to categorize her and reminding them that no woman is ever entirely one thing. Still, shadows gathered. For though she lived in grandeur, though she presided at Cliveden, though she seemed secure in her place, time itself is relentless. The deaths of her earlier husbands, the weight of her nickname, the endless curiosity of society, all pressed upon her like a tide that could not be resisted. She remained luminous, but the questions never ceased. Could one live so close to scandal forever without being consumed by it? Could one dance at the edge of death so long without slipping? The candlelight flickered even in Cliveden's vast halls, as though reminding her that opulence and mortality were never truly separate. The gardens at dawn captured this truth in silence. Dew gathered on roses, their petals heavy yet fragile, reflecting the first light of day in droplets that would vanish as the sun rose higher. Enid, walking through those gardens in the quiet hours, may have seen in them her own reflection. Beauty radiant, yet fleeting, touched by time even as it seemed eternal. Did she pause to breathe in their scent, to let the morning stillness settle around her? Or did she hurry onward, already thinking of the evening to come, the guests to be entertained, the performance to be continued? We cannot know, but perhaps the gardens, more than the rooms of Cliveden, held the truth of her life. Splendor laced with fragility, permanence veiled by impermanence. And so the dew remained, unshaken, clinging to roses in the cool air, unresolved, waiting for the sun to lift it away, just as whispers clung still to her name, awaiting their own moment of dispersal that never quite arrived. The dew upon the roses lingered for only a short while, jeweled in the morning light, before the sun rose higher and dissolved them into air, leaving behind nothing but memory of their brief perfection. So too did the admiration that surrounded Enid Lindeman often vanish into the harsher light of day, giving way to whispers, to suspicion, to the unrelenting scrutiny of a society that could never look away from her. In those early mornings at Cliveden, when the estate lay hushed and only the gardeners moved quietly through the lawns, one imagines her walking among the flowers, lifting the edge of her gown from the damp grass, her thoughts already heavy with the weight of her name. For while the roses bowed under the fragile burden of dew, Enid bore the heavier burden of a reputation that grew more fixed with each passing year. The nickname that had first been spoken as jest with a kind of wicked delight now began to harden into something sharper. She was Lady Kilmore, they said, the woman whose husbands did not survive her, the woman who moved through society cloaked in both beauty and doom. It is difficult to say when precisely the whisper became a certainty, for such transformations happen not at once, but slowly, like ivy creeping along a stone wall until the entire surface is covered. Perhaps it was at one of her grand dinners, when a guest leaned too close and in jest that carried its own sting, remarked upon the danger of accepting her hand. Perhaps it was in the hushed voices of women in drawing rooms who watched her sweep into a space and felt both admiration and dread. Perhaps it was in the newspapers that printed with subtle insinuation the stories of her widowhood, her lovers, her boldness. However it began, it spread, until the name was no longer a joke, but a shadow that clung to her presence in every hall she entered. She could not escape it, and perhaps she did not wish to. For scandal, though cruel, can also be a kind of armor. It separates, it protects, it grants its bearer a strange and terrible power. And Enid understood power. She had lived through 3 husbands, each of them men of wealth and stature, each leaving her both richer and more notorious. She had danced with danger in affairs that unsettled convention, had faced down gossip with a smile that turned whispers into silence. She had climbed higher than anyone might have imagined a girl from Australia could, rising into the very heart of British society. To be called Lady Kilmore was not, in the end, only condemnation. It was also recognition, an acknowledgement that she stood apart, that she was not like other women, that she belonged to a category of her own invention. And in that recognition lay a kind of triumph, even if it came wrapped in suspicion. Still, the triumph was not without cost. To carry such a name was to live always beneath its shadow, to have every gesture, every glance, every silence interpreted through it. When she laughed, it was a dangerous laugh. When she wept, it was theatrical. When she showed kindness, it was manipulation. The simplest act became distorted by the lens of her reputation, and she could no longer be seen as only human. Did this wound her, or did she simply accept it as the price of her chosen freedom? Did she ever long for the anonymity of her youth, the days when she walked verandas in Australia unknown to the world? Or had she grown accustomed to notoriety as one grows accustomed to fine jewelry, heavy yet impossible to remove? We cannot know. What remains is only the image of a woman both elevated and confined by the stories told about her. It was in these years that she began to refine scandal into performance. If society expected her to dazzle, she would dazzle more. If they called her dangerous, she would lean into danger with a smile that unsettled and enchanted. At parties, she moved with the grace of someone who knew that every eye was upon her. Every word she spoke carried beyond its immediate hearer. Every choice of gown or jewel would be remembered and repeated. She dressed not merely to adorn herself, but to command attention, her silks and diamonds becoming extensions of her reputation. She laughed easily, but the ease was sharpened by calculation, for she understood that laughter, too, could be a weapon. She lived as though on a stage, each act deliberate, each gesture part of a script that she both performed and rewrote in the same moment. Yet behind performance lay a private truth, one glimpsed only in fragments. There were those who spoke of her generosity, her capacity for loyalty, her intelligence in conversation that went beyond wit into true understanding. These glimpses suggest that beneath the legend of Lady Kilmore was still Enid Lindeman, a woman navigating the contradictions of her time, refusing to surrender to the narrow roles offered her. Perhaps she used scandal because it was the only freedom available, the only way to carve out a life not dictated by others. If so, then the nickname, though cruel, was also her creation, shaped and repurposed into something she could wield rather than be wounded by. The world around her, however, was changing. The years pressed forward, and with them came shifts in society, in politics, in the delicate balance of privilege that sustained her world. Cliveden remained a beacon, but even beacons can be threatened by storms. The whispers of scandal began to mingle with darker murmurs of politics, alliances, and conflicts that stretched beyond drawing rooms and ballrooms. Enid, though never a politician, stood close enough to power to feel its tremors. And so the nickname that had once been merely social scandal began to intersect with matters far larger, as though fate insisted on binding her story always to danger. Through it all, she remained luminous, her presence undeniable, and yet one imagines her at times standing once more before a mirror, seeing her reflection framed by light and shadow, the face of Lady Kilmore gazing back at her. Did she ever ask the mirror whether it showed the truth or only the mask the world had given her? Did she smile into its silence, or did she turn away, unwilling to confront the question? The mirror gives no answer, and perhaps that is why it suited her so well. In silence, one may weave whatever story one chooses. The mirror remained, its surface smooth, its truth unspoken, even as the faint sound of music drifted again through the house. But this time, not the joyous music of ballrooms. It was fainter, sadder, a melody carried from some distant place, as though the air itself remembered tunes from years long past. It lingered, unresolved, fading into the hush of evening, waiting to lead her onward into yet another chapter, where desire and freedom would entwine more deeply still, and the music of scandal would play on. The music that lingered faintly in the evening air was not the triumphant swell of a ballroom orchestra, but something gentler, sadder, like the echo of a melody half remembered. It drifted without resolution, as though searching for an end it could not quite find, and in that space of uncertainty, Enid Lindeman moved forward into another chapter of her life. For music, like life itself, carries us even when we do not know the steps, and Enid had always known how to dance without waiting for permission. If others listened for harmony, she found her own rhythm, and it was this defiance of expectation that came to define her most deeply. Society might brand her with scandalous names, but Enid, in her essence, was a woman who refused to live by the rules written for her sex. Her philosophy was simple yet radical for her time. She would live as freely as any man, loving whom she chose, speaking when she wished, and daring to claim joy without apology. It was this freedom that gave rise to her many affairs, which scandalized drawing rooms and gave gossips endless sustenance. For Enid did not hide her desires, nor did she confine them to secrecy in the way so many others did. If she wanted companionship, she sought it openly, and if she loved without shame. Men of influence and wealth were drawn to her, not only because of her beauty, which was undeniable, but because of the vitality she exuded, the sense that in her company life would always be brighter, fuller, less restrained. To walk beside her was to step into a world where convention dissolved, where laughter was louder, where evening stretched into dawn, and where danger itself seemed strangely alluring. It was intoxicating, and those who fell into her orbit rarely escaped unmarked. Some spoke of her as reckless, as though her lovers were merely trophies collected without care. Others insisted that she was deliberate, choosing carefully those whose names and fortunes matched her ambitions. The truth, as always, lay somewhere more elusive, for Enid was not easily defined, and her desires may have been as much about the thrill of freedom as about love or calculation. In her affairs, she expressed not only passion but rebellion, a refusal to accept the narrow confines offered to women of her standing. To love openly was to declare herself equal, to claim what men claimed without hesitation, to take for herself the rights so often denied. That society recoiled from this only seemed to confirm the necessity of her defiance. These affairs were not without consequence. Husbands of other women grew jealous, friends turned wary, and gossip became ever sharper. At times she was shunned from certain circles, only to be welcomed back later with even greater fascination. For scandal, though it excludes, also attracts, and Enid's very refusal to be humbled made her irresistible to those who craved excitement in a world bound by etiquette and routine. She was both danger and delight, a figure who could unsettle a room with her arrival and leave it emptier with her absence. The contradictions in her nature mirrored the contradictions of the age itself, a society caught between tradition and modernity, restraint and liberation, propriety and desire. To understand her, one must see that freedom was not for Enid an abstract principle, but a live necessity. She had endured widowhood 3 times, had watched as death stripped away the promises of security that others clung to. She knew too well how fragile stability could be, how swiftly fortune could shift. And so she lived not for the future, but for the moment, not for approval, but for experience. If she shocked others, perhaps it was because she revealed the precariousness of the order they sought to maintain. She was, in a sense, a mirror of their own suppressed desires, their own fears of mortality, their own longing for release. And like all mirrors, she unsettled by showing too much truth. One can imagine her at a dinner, laughter rising like smoke into the candlelight, her eyes bright, her voice quick with wit. Around her, men leaned in, caught by her magnetism, while women watched with mingled suspicion and admiration. She was a presence that filled the space, impossible to ignore, impossible to contain. And yet, beneath the brilliance, there must have been solitude. For freedom, while intoxicating, also isolates. To live without the approval of others is to walk a road that few will accompany for long. Did she feel this isolation? Did she ever long for gentleness instead of excitement, for quiet companionship instead of endless pursuit? Perhaps she did, in moments when the laughter had faded and the night grew still. But if so, she rarely allowed such longing to show. Her mask was her armor, and she wore it with skill. The world called her many things: scandalous, dangerous, audacious, reckless. But seldom did they call her what she most embodied: courageous. For courage is not only found on battlefields or in great causes, it is also found in the refusal to surrender oneself to the small cages society builds, in the insistence on living authentically, even when others recoil. Enid's courage was imperfect, flawed, entangled with vanity and desire, yet it was courage nonetheless. She lived as she chose, and in that choice she exposed the hypocrisy of those who condemned her while envying her freedom. Still, freedom carries with it a price, and the price was the sharpening of her reputation. Lady Kilmore, once a jest, then a whisper, was now spoken as truth, as certainty. Every affair, every death, every gesture became evidence in the unspoken case society built against her. She became a legend of danger, a woman who embodied not only allure but threat. And legends, while powerful, are rarely comfortable. They isolate as much as they elevate. They turn flesh into symbol. They erase the simple humanity beneath. To live as a legend is to be both remembered and misunderstood, both celebrated and condemned. Enid bore this paradox with the same poise with which she bore her jewels, but one cannot doubt the weight of it. The music that had drifted faintly through the air lingered still, unresolved, as though echoing the unresolved question of her life. Was she free, or was she trapped by the very freedom she sought? Did she command her destiny, or was she only playing the part society demanded of her? The notes rose and fell, fading into the night, leaving behind silence. And in that silence, another sound began to emerge, soft yet insistent. The voices of gossip, sharpened now into conviction, filling the corridors of Cliveden and the drawing rooms of London. They grew louder, more relentless, until they became a chorus that could not be ignored. And so the unresolved music gave way to the murmur of voices, closing one chapter and opening the next, where the consequences of freedom would be measured not in laughter, but in rumor, not in desire, but in judgment. The murmur of voices, soft at first but swelling into a chorus, filled the air around her like an unseen tide, and wherever she went it seemed to follow, pressing close, insistent. Gossip is a sound without source, without owner, yet it lingers more stubbornly than truth. It was this chorus that accompanied Enid Lindeman as she stepped into her fourth marriage, into the house of Astor, into the grandeur of Cliveden. If her previous unions had brought her wealth and notoriety, this one brought her permanence, a seat at the very center of English high society, a position as secure as any woman of her age could imagine. And yet, though the stone walls of Cliveden stood firm, the whispers still slipped through, as though no estate, however vast, could keep them out. Waldorf Astor was not like the men she had married before. He was quieter, more restrained, a man shaped less by extravagance than by duty. His life had been one of inheritance and responsibility, a path that led him naturally into politics, where his voice carried influence far beyond his own household. He was, by all accounts, a man of seriousness, even of solemnity, and it might have seemed unlikely that he would bind his life to that of Enid, whose reputation by then had already outgrown her. Yet perhaps it was precisely this contrast that drew them together. For Waldorf, Enid was a spark of audacity, a force of vitality that unsettled and enlivened him. For Enid, Waldorf represented not only wealth, though his fortune was immense, but stability, the kind of permanence she had never known, the kind of name that even scandal could not undo. Their marriage brought her into Cliveden, a house as much a symbol as a home. The estate stretched wide upon the banks of the Thames, its terraces overlooking gardens that seemed endless, its rooms filled with portraits and artifacts that reminded every guest of the weight of Astor history. Here, Enid became not only a wife but a hostess of the first rank, presiding over gatherings that drew politicians, aristocrats, and artists into the same rooms. The Cliveden set, as it came to be known, became a place where the currents of influence flowed as surely as the river itself, and Enid stood at its center, not as decoration but as force. Her wit was sharp, her presence magnetic, her command of the room undeniable. She could turn debate into laughter, tension into ease, and in so doing she carved out a place for herself that even her detractors could not ignore. Yet even here, in the grandeur of Cliveden, the old name followed her. Lady Kilmore, whispered beneath the chandeliers, passed from mouth to mouth over glasses of wine. 3 husbands dead, now a 4th. How long before he, too, would fall? It was said half in jest, half in fear, yet always with that note of fascination that scandal demands. Enid bore it as she always had, with a smile that turned rumor into curiosity, with a poise that refused to let the nickname wound her. Perhaps she even welcomed it, knowing that attention, however sharpened, was a form of power. For in the game of society, to be ignored is death, but to be whispered about is to remain alive in the imagination of others. Her days at Cliveden were filled with a strange mixture of luxury and responsibility. She oversaw the entertainments, the dinners, the dances, the endless flow of guests that the Astors drew into their orbit. She managed the staff with a precision that kept the vast house running like a machine. Yet she did so with flair, turning each event into something unforgettable. She had the instincts of a performer, and in this role she found a stage large enough for her talents. Yet one must wonder whether, in the quiet of her chambers, she ever felt caged by the very grandeur that seemed to free her. For a house so vast can feel, to its mistress, as confining as any small room, its stone walls a reminder not only of security, but of scrutiny. Still, she thrived. She adorned the house with her presence, and in return, the house gave her permanence. Unlike her earlier marriages, which had ended too quickly, this one endured. Waldorf did not wither as the others had, and in his survival the chorus of whispers grew less certain, less confident. Perhaps, some said, the curse was broken. Perhaps she had found at last not only fortune, but constancy. And yet, though the whispers softened, they never disappeared. Once given, a name cannot be erased, and Lady Kilmore remained etched into her story, no matter how gilded her surroundings. The gardens of Cliveden carried their own reflections of her life. In summer, roses spilled in abundance, their petals heavy with color and scent, drawing visitors to linger among them. In winter, frost covered the lawns, the statues of the terraces standing cold and silent against pale skies. Enid, walking through them, may have seen in these changes a mirror of her own seasons. Brilliance, decline, renewal, endurance. For all her scandals and her losses, she endured. She outlived the whispers, she outlived the deaths, she outlived even the certainty of her detractors. There was resilience in her, a strength hidden beneath silk and laughter, a determination to survive whatever life placed before her. That determination, more than scandal, defined her, yet even resilience cannot escape the question of how one wishes to be remembered. Did Enid, strolling through the gardens in early dawn, dew gathering once more upon roses, think of her reputation, of the name that clung to her? Did she hope it might one day fade, or did she accept that it would outlive her, that she would be remembered not only as a hostess of Cliveden, but as Lady Kilmore, the scandal that refused to die? Perhaps she did not think of it at all, choosing instead to breathe in the morning air, to live in the moment as she always had. But perhaps, in the stillness, she allowed herself to wonder. The dew remained, heavy and luminous, clinging to petals that would in time be scattered by the wind. And so, too, did her story remain suspended between admiration and suspicion, permanence and fragility. The curtain of night drew across the gardens, and with it came the sound of a curtain being pulled shut within the house, soft and deliberate, closing one scene and preparing the stage for another. The sound of a curtain drawn shut is soft, almost unnoticeable, and yet it changes everything. Light is dimmed, the view erased, the outside world kept at bay. Within Cliveden, as the velvet folds fell into place, so too did a quieter darkness gather around Enid Lindeman. For in those hidden spaces where voices carried without witnesses, the whispers about her grew more pointed, more deliberate, sharpened by envy and by fear. Gossip, like a knife, can be wielded with subtlety or with force, and by now her name had become the blade upon which others carve their own security. She was spoken of not only as scandalous, but as dangerous, a woman who embodied both allure and threat. And though she carried herself with grace and poise, the sound of those whispers was always in the air, as present as the rustling of leaves in the Cliveden gardens. It is curious how society, which thrives on appearances, often feeds upon destruction. The very same circles that welcomed her into their dinners and laughed at her stories were the ones most eager to repeat tales of her husband's deaths, her lover's indiscretions, her supposed schemes. In such retellings, she was no longer simply Enid, but a figure of myth, her life compressed into a story that suited the needs of those who told it. Lady Kilmore, they said with a smile that carried unease, the woman whose husbands died too soon, the woman whose freedom was mistaken for cruelty. Envy gave the name weight, fear gave it persistence, and scandal gave it wings. And so the curtain that was drawn at Cliveden did not keep out the voices. It only made them echo louder in the stillness. There is cruelty in gossip, but there is also truth, though not the truth it pretends to carry. The truth lies not in the stories themselves, which are always colored by invention, but in what they reveal about those who tell them. Enid, by her very existence, unsettled the order upon which others depended. She was a woman who lived as men lived, who loved as men loved, who refused to apologize for the choices she made. In her they saw both temptation and threat, and so they clothed their discomfort in rumor, fashioning weapons from words. To call her Lady Kilmore was to protect themselves from the more troubling realization that perhaps she was simply free, and that freedom was more frightening than scandal. Yet Enid bore it with the same composure with which she had borne widowhood and loss. She smiled when others expected her to bristle. She charmed when others thought she might retreat. In this way, she disarmed gossip, not by denying it, but by absorbing it, transforming it into part of her legend. The more they spoke, the more her presence grew, until she was not merely a woman among them, but a figure who seemed to move slightly apart, slightly above, as if she belonged not to their society, but to a story they could not control. This, too, was power, though it was a lonely kind of power, for to be mythologized is to be separated from ordinary company, admired and feared, but never quite embraced. One imagines her walking the long marble corridors of Cliveden after a dinner had ended, the guests departed, the room silent once more. The sound of her own footsteps echoed faintly against the stone, and perhaps in those moments she heard in them the voices of the day, the laughter that hid envy, the whispers that masked fear. Did she resent it, Or did she accept it as inevitable? Did she ever long for a simpler life, where her name carried no shadow, where her presence was not endlessly scrutinized? Perhaps she did, though if so, she never let it show. Instead, she continued forward, each step deliberate, each gesture calculated, as though reminding both herself and others that she could not be undone by rumor alone. Gossip, however, is not merely noise, it is also inheritance. It lingers longer than truth, passed from one generation to the next, shaping memory more deeply than fact. Enid must have sensed this, must have known that the stories told about her would outlive her, that the name Lady Kilmore would cling to her in history as it had in life. Did this knowledge trouble her, or did she embrace it as yet another form of survival? For what is remembered, even if distorted, is not lost, and in that sense, scandal, cruel though it was, ensured her immortality. Those who condemned her ensured, in their very condemnation, that she would never be forgotten. Still, immortality comes at a cost. To live surrounded by suspicion is to live always in partial solitude, for trust is eroded by fear. Even among friends, there must have been distance, a hesitation that could never be overcome. To love her was to risk reputation. To marry her was to invite whispers of doom. She lived, therefore, in a space between intimacy and exile, desired yet doubted, admired yet mistrusted. This paradox defined her as much as her beauty or her charm, and it is this paradox that makes her story endure. She was never one thing, never wholly saint nor sinner, but a shifting figure who refused to settle into the categories society demanded. The curtain that had been drawn shut remained still, its folds unmoving, yet behind it, life continued. Outside, the gardens of Cliveden breathed in the night air, the roses slowly closing their petals, the river gliding silently past. Within, Enid remained, luminous even in solitude, her shadow stretching across the marble floor, and though gossip sought to diminish her, it could not dim the truth of her presence, the undeniable force of her being. She was Lady Kilmore, yes, but she was also Enid, the girl from Australia who had refused to remain within the boundaries set for her, who had taken for herself the life others would not grant. Perhaps in the end, it is this truth that outshines the whispers, though the whispers may never fully fade. The night deepened, silence settling once more over Cliveden, broken only by the faint hum of aircraft passing far overhead, their engines low and distant, carrying with them the reminder of a world beyond the estate, a world moving toward upheaval and war. The gossip of drawing rooms was soon to be joined by the harsher voices of conflict, and Enid's life, already marked by scandal, was about to be touched by history's wider storms. The hum of aircraft passed over Cliveden in the night, distant but insistent, as though reminding all beneath their shadow that the world was changing. It was no longer only the gossip of drawing rooms that shaped lives, no longer only the laughter and scandal of salons, but the darker murmur of war gathering across Europe. For Enid Lindeman, now Lady Astor, the Second World War arrived not as an abstract event, but as a presence that entered her very household, reshaping the rhythms of her life and the roles she was expected to play. The great estate on the Thames, so long a place of spectacle and luxury, became in those years a refuge and a stronghold, a house that bore witness to the anxieties and the resilience of a society under siege. Cliveden did not close its doors during those years. It shifted its purpose. Guests still came, though now they came not only to dine and to dance, but to discuss the war, to seek comfort, to find in its halls a sense of continuity amidst the upheaval. Soldiers, statesmen, and friends gathered under its roof, and Enid presided as she always had, with grace and command. Yet there was a difference now, a gravity that even her laughter could not entirely dispel. Conversation stretched long into the night, voices low, the air heavy with the awareness that beyond those walls, bombs were falling, cities burning, lives ending. Even within Cliveden's safety, the sound of distant engines carried through the air, a reminder that no place was untouched. For Enid, who had always thrived in the realm of society and scandal, this new reality demanded a different kind of resilience. She was no longer simply the center of entertainment. She became, in her way, a figure of stability, a hostess who held together the fragile fabric of normality for those who entered her home. The same presence that once disarmed gossip now offered comfort, her charm a shield against despair. She organized dinners not only for celebration but for solidarity, her conversations carrying both wit and a quiet strength that reassured her guests. And yet, behind the performance, she must have felt the same unease as all others, the uncertainty of survival, the awareness of fragility. For war is the great equalizer, rendering wealth and scandal alike small against its vast shadow. Her husband Waldorf, engaged in political duties, moved within the circles of decision-making, his influence carrying weight in those critical years. Enid stood beside him, not as a silent companion, but as a partner whose presence lent him both support and confidence. She had long been accustomed to walking among powerful men, but in wartime, the stakes were sharper, the consequences heavier. And though she was never a politician, her role was not insignificant. In her conversations, in her ability to host, in the simple act of keeping Cliveden alive as a place of gathering, she contributed to the morale that sustained those who bore heavier burdens. It is worth pausing to consider how her scandalous reputation, the name of Lady Kilmore, sat amidst this new world of war. For gossip thrives in times of peace, but in war, it takes on a different character. Some continued to whisper, of course, they always would, but perhaps the sharpness softened. Perhaps suspicion gave way to gratitude. A woman who could bring light into dark times, who could host with grace even as the world trembled, was needed. And so the same qualities that once unsettled were now reinterpreted as resilience, as vitality, as a refusal to be cowed. Reputation is never fixed. It shifts with circumstance. And Enid, who had mastered the art of living within contradiction, understood this as well as anyone. Still, the hum of aircraft was never far. At night, when the estate lay quiet, the sound grew louder, the engines crossing the skies like dark omens. The great windows of Cliveden were blackened to hide from bombers, the gardens fell silent, and in the stillness, fear pressed close. Did Enid in those hours remember the deaths that had already touched her life? Did she feel once more the fragility of existence, the uncertainty of tomorrow? Perhaps she did, though if so, she did not let it diminish her public presence. She had learned long before that fear must be carried privately, that to show it was to surrender to it, and she was not one to surrender. And yet, even amidst fear, life persisted. There were still mornings when the dew gathered on roses, still evenings when laughter echoed faintly through the halls, still moments when beauty asserted itself against the backdrop of destruction. Enid, with her indomitable spirit, embodied this persistence. She dressed as elegantly as ever, she walked with the same poise, she spoke with the same wit. To those around her, she was proof that the world, though shaken, could endure. And in this endurance lay her true gift, not merely scandal, not merely beauty, but survival, the art of living fully even when all else seemed poised to collapse. The war passed, as wars always do, leaving behind its scars, its silences, its memories that would never be erased. Cliveden returned to its role as a house of splendor, its gardens blooming once more, its halls filled again with music. And Enid emerged from those years as she had from all others, luminous, intact, her legend both darkened and enriched by experience. She had survived again, as she always did, and in surviving, she reminded those who watched her that survival itself can be a form of triumph. The hum of aircraft faded into memory, leaving behind the faint scent of perfume from an opened letter, as though the past itself had written to her, carrying both sorrow and endurance in its fold. The faint scent of perfume lingered on the paper of the opened letter, drifting upward into the still air of Cliveden, as though the past itself had paused to breathe upon the present. Such scents, delicate yet insistent, have the power to summon entire worlds of memory. And for Enid Lindeman, they must have carried the reminder that even amidst ashes, life insists upon renewal. The war had ended, leaving its scars upon nations and upon individuals alike, yet in the years that followed, she moved again with the same vitality that had always marked her path. Where others emerged from the darkness weary, she seemed somehow to burn brighter, as though conflict had stripped away the unnecessary and left her with an even sharper sense of how brief and precious life must be. The Cliveden estate, once shuttered in fear, opened its doors wide once more, and its halls once again filled with music and conversation. Enid presided with renewed energy, hosting dinners and gatherings that drew not only the familiar circle of aristocrats and politicians, but also artists, actors, and foreign guests, eager to see the house that had become as much legend as dwelling. Her evenings were lavish, the tables adorned with flowers and candles, the wine flowing freely, the laughter carrying long past midnight. And at the center of it all stood Enid, luminous as ever, her voice quick, her eyes alive, her presence commanding without ever appearing forced. She seemed to belong not merely to the moment, but to the story itself, a figure who had outlived her detractors, who had made survival itself into a kind of art. It was in these post-war years that her legend grew not only darker, but also strangely more admired. The old nickname of Lady Kilmore still clung to her, but now it was spoken with less suspicion and more fascination. The years had softened the cruelty of gossip, transforming it into myth. 3 husbands gone, 1 still alive at her side, countless affairs rumored. These things no longer threatened to scandalize, but instead to entertain. She had become, in the eyes of many, not a danger, but a symbol, proof that one could live boldly and yet endure, that one could defy expectation and yet remain firmly at society's center. And though envy still whispered, admiration spoke more loudly, for few could match her combination of charm, audacity, and sheer resilience. Her gatherings reflected this change. They were no longer merely social occasions, but spectacles of survival, testaments to a world that had refused to collapse. Musicians played in drawing rooms where windows now stood unshuttered. Guests wandered through gardens that once again bloomed, and the air was filled not with the drone of aircraft, but with the sound of voices unafraid. Enid herself embodied this transformation, dressing with as much elegance as ever, wearing jewels that caught candlelight and laughter alike, speaking with the assurance of someone who had not only survived, but flourished. Her very existence seemed to tell a story, that the passage through death and scandal and war could leave one not diminished, but magnified. And yet, as always with Enid, the brilliance was never without shadow. Beneath the music and the flowers, beneath the perfume that lingered in the air, there remained the silent awareness of mortality. She had lived through more deaths than most, had worn widowhood as others wore shawls, had seen the fragility of stability more clearly than anyone. Perhaps it was this awareness that gave her the urgency to live so lavishly, to host so brightly, to laugh so loudly. Perhaps each evening of splendor was, for her, a defiance of silence, a refusal to allow death the final word. She may have known, better than anyone, that each dinner could be the last. each dance the final step, each letter the final word from someone dear. And so she celebrated, not recklessly but deliberately, as though each moment of joy was an offering to life itself. It is worth asking whether she was truly happy in these years, or whether the mask of brilliance concealed solitude. For even surrounded by guests, a hostess remains alone, the focus of all eyes but the companion of none. Did she feel, in the quiet after the last guest had departed, a hollow in the great house, a silence that pressed close in the corridors? Or did she find in that silence a kind of peace, a space in which to breathe freely after the performance was done? History leaves us only fragments, but perhaps the truth lies in the balance between the two. She was neither entirely fulfilled nor entirely lonely. She was simply alive, carrying both contradictions with the same poise she carried her jewels. What cannot be denied is that she endured. When so many of her contemporaries faded, forgotten by time or consumed by scandal, Enid remained. She had mastered the art of reinvention, of transforming suspicion into fascination, loss into resilience, rumor into legend. She was not without flaws, but perhaps it was the flaws that made her enduring. Perfection fades. Imperfection lingers because it unsettles. It raises questions that are never answered. Enid was such a question, walking in silk through the halls of Cliveden, laughing among guests who whispered her name even as they adored her. The years after the war were not easy for Britain. Rationing lingered, the empire shifted, the old order began to crack. But within Cliveden, beneath the chandeliers, a sense of continuity remained, sustained in part by Enid herself. She became, in a way, a bridge between worlds, the old society of scandal and splendor, and the new society of austerity and rebuilding. Guests who entered her home found both the comfort of tradition and the excitement of defiance, both rootedness and freedom. And in this, she offered them not only entertainment, but also hope, the assurance that life could still be lived fully, even in the shadow of loss. The opened letter remained on the table, its perfume fading slowly into the air, its words read and reread until they blurred into memory. Outside, the night pressed gently against the windows, and somewhere a door closed softly, carrying with it the reminder that every evening, however splendid, must come to an end. The sound of a door closing softly in the night is easily overlooked, yet it carries with it the weight of transition, of privacy reclaimed, of secrets held within walls that do not speak. So it was with Enid Lindeman in those later years, when the brilliance of her public life at Cliveden was matched by the quieter, more intricate patterns of her private entanglements. For if the dinners and the parties gave her legend its brilliance, the secret doors gave it its shadow. Behind them lay the stories of her lovers, the men who came to her not as husbands or guests, but as confidants, companions, and sometimes as fleeting flames that left behind only a trace of smoke in the air. To speak of these lovers is to step into the realm of uncertainty, for here fact and rumor blend most completely. Some were named openly, men of prominence whose reputations could withstand the scandal of association. Others remained whispered only in half-told stories, their names obscured, their presence known only through glances caught across rooms, letters that disappeared, footsteps that creaked upon stairs after midnight. What is clear, however, is that Enid did not live bound to the narrow definition of fidelity that society demanded of her. She loved as she chose, she sought companionship where she found it, and she refused to apologize for her desires. In this, she was perhaps more honest than her critics, who condemned her while quietly pursuing their own indiscretions. Desire, for Enid, was not only physical, but also intellectual, emotional, even philosophical. She was drawn to vitality, to intelligence, to men who matched her daring spirit. Some offered her stability, others offered excitement, Still others offered the mirror of her own restless hunger. In each, she seemed to seek not merely pleasure but recognition, the acknowledgement that she was more than a hostess, more than a wife, more than a scandal. To be desired was, for her, to be affirmed, to be reminded of her power, to feel herself alive in ways that jewels and titles could never provide. And yet within this affirmation there was also risk, for intimacy always reveals as much as it conceals, and in love, as in scandal, she remained both vulnerable and dangerous. It is easy to imagine her in those quiet hours when the last guest had departed and the house grew still. A single lamp burning, its light soft upon her face, a glass half filled beside her, the perfume of the evening lingering in the folds of her gown. In such moments, a lover's presence might have been less about passion than about companionship. The comfort of a voice in the silence, the warmth of another presence in a life too often defined by scrutiny. Did she seek love in these affairs, or simply freedom from the roles imposed upon her? Did she believe in the promises whispered in such hours, or did she accept them as illusions, fragile yet necessary, like the flickering light of the lamp itself? The answers lie hidden with her, carried into the silence she left behind. Her lovers, whether lasting or fleeting, became part of her legend, woven into the fabric of her reputation. Some admired her boldness, seeing in her affairs the embodiment of a woman unwilling to live within hypocrisy. Others condemned her as reckless, dangerous, incapable of true devotion. But perhaps both views missed the truth, which is that she lived within contradiction, embracing both freedom and vulnerability, desire and solitude. She was not merely a seductress, nor merely a seeker of love, but a woman navigating her own path through the complexities of longing and expectation. To reduce her to one or the other is to miss the depth of her humanity, the richness of her contradictions. There is also the question of masks, for intimacy does not always strip away disguise. Sometimes it requires it. Enid, so practiced in the art of performance, may have worn different masks even in her most private moments. To some lovers, she was the enchantress, luminous and untouchable. To others, she was the confidant, listening with patience and care. To still others, perhaps, she was simply herself, stripped of grandeur, weary yet resilient, a woman who desired not scandal but companionship. Which mask was truest? Which moment most authentic? We cannot know, for the truth of intimacy is always hidden, seen only by those who were present, and even they may not have understood it fully. What we do know is that these secret doors, these softly closed spaces, gave her life a richness that public scandal could never capture. They were the places where she was not legend, but woman, where she sought what all seek: connection, recognition, the feeling of being known. That she pursued these things boldly without apology only deepens the complexity of her story. For in her, freedom was not an abstract concept, but a lived reality, one that carried both beauty and risk, both joy and loneliness. She embraced it fully, even when it unsettled others, even when it added weight to the name that shadowed her. And yet there is tenderness in this part of her life as well. To think of her lovers only as scandal is to miss the possibility of affection, of care, of genuine companionship. It is to forget that even in the midst of legend, there are quiet moments of vulnerability, of trust, of shared silence. Perhaps these moments were fleeting. Perhaps they were more lasting than we imagine. But either way, they remind us that Enid's life was not only a story of scandal, but also of longing, of the same desires that bind us all. In this, she was not untouchable myth, but human, flawed and yearning, luminous and uncertain. The door that closed softly in the night remained shut, guarding its secrets, holding within it the truth that history can never fully reveal. Outside, rain began to fall against the glass, soft at first, then steadier, as though the world itself wept in sympathy or in memory. The sound of it filled the silence, unresolved, carrying the story onward into the next chapter, where reflection would deepen into enigma and questions would remain without answers. The rain tapped softly against the glass, at first a gentle rhythm, then steady, as though the sky itself sought to whisper secrets that could not be spoken aloud. It blurred the view beyond the windows, dissolving the outlines of the garden into shifting shadows and streaks of light, and in that obscurity one finds a fitting image for Enid Lindeman herself, for she was, above all, an enigma, never seen clearly, never grasped entirely, her truth always slipping away like a reflection upon rain-darkened glass. To some, she was a seductress, dangerous and deliberate, a woman who ensnared men with beauty and charm only to see them fade too soon. To others, she was a victim of fate, bound by the cruel repetition of loss, a woman cursed rather than cursed herself. And to still others, she was simply a survivor, bold and unapologetic, who refused to bow to the roles society prescribed. Which of these was she? Perhaps she was all of them, perhaps she was none, or perhaps her genius lay in never being only one thing. The difficulty of knowing her lies in the contradictions she embodied. She was both generous and calculating, both loyal and reckless, both playful and serious. At dinners she dazzled with wit, yet in solitude she may have wept quietly for the lives and loves she had lost. She sought freedom with ferocity, yet may have longed for constancy as deeply as any woman of her age. She lived for desire and for admiration, yet she also endured loneliness that admiration could not erase. These contradictions do not cancel one another. Rather, they coexist, creating a complexity that resists all simple judgments. And it is this complexity, more than scandal, that has ensured her legend. For a figure who can be explained is soon forgotten, but a figure who resists explanation lingers in the imagination forever. The rain against the glass carried with it the sound of reflection, the kind of sound that draws the mind inward. One imagines Enid herself listening to such rain in her later years, her hands folded upon her lap, her gaze fixed not upon the garden, but upon the shifting mirror of memory. Did she wonder how she would be remembered, whether the stories told about her would capture anything of her true self? Did she laugh at the nickname of Lady Kilmore, dismissing it as the invention of envious tongues, or did she secretly fear that it would become the only thing history recalled? There is no record of her answer, only the certainty that the question must have haunted her, as it haunts us still. What makes her so elusive is that her life cannot be read as a neat sequence of events. It is not simply the story of 4 marriages and many lovers, of dinners and jewels, of deaths and scandals. It is instead the story of a spirit navigating a world both fascinated by and hostile to women who refuse to be contained. Her choices, whether deliberate or instinctive, always defied expectation. She did not mourn as long as others demanded. She did not apologize when others wished she would. She did not retreat when others sought to push her aside. Each refusal unsettled, and each unsettled moment fed the legend. Yet behind the legend was still a woman, shaped by loss, by longing, by courage, by the relentless passage of time. In her, we see the timeless conflict between how a person lives and how a person is remembered. Enid lived with vitality, with freedom, with boldness. Yet she is remembered most often by a name that reduces her to suspicion. Is this fair, or is it inevitable? History, after all, is written less by truth than by fascination, and scandal fascinates more deeply than virtue. But perhaps Enid herself understood this and accepted it. Perhaps she knew that to be remembered as a mystery was better than to be forgotten as a certainty. If so, then her enigma was not only the product of others' perception, but also her own creation. A mask she wore even in solitude, a mask that became indistinguishable from her face. The rain blurred the glass until it seemed less a window than a mirror, and in that mirror her image appeared not as clear portrait, but as silhouette. She is always glimpsed, never grasped, always present, never possessed. To chase her truth is like chasing the rain itself. One may feel its touch, hear its sound, even taste it on the lips, but one cannot hold it in the hand without it slipping away. This, perhaps, is her greatest triumph, that she cannot be captured, that her story continues to provoke questions rather than answers. In this way, she remains alive, her voice still murmuring through the corridors of memory, her laughter still echoing faintly in rooms long emptied. Yet enigmas carry loneliness as their price. To be many things is also to be no single thing, and to be ungraspable is to remain partly alone. Did she feel this loneliness, hidden beneath the jewels and the laughter, beneath the gossip and the scandal? Did she long for someone who might see her not as Lady Kilmore nor as hostess of Cliveden, but simply as Enid, a woman who desired, who feared, who hoped? Perhaps she did, though whether such recognition was ever offered we cannot say, and perhaps she came to accept that such recognition was impossible, that her life was destined to remain not a confession, but a riddle. The rain slowed, its rhythm softening against the glass, until the night beyond could once more be glimpsed, pale and shifting. And in that moment of pause, the sound seemed to fade into silence, leaving behind only the trace of dampness on the window, a reminder of what had passed. So too does her life linger for us, not present, not clear, yet marked by traces that cannot be erased. She remains even now an unanswered question, an image half seen, a presence both near and elusive. And as the rain gave way to stillness, another sound emerged, the faint turning of a page in an old album, its paper worn, its images fading, yet still holding the likeness of faces long gone. The page turned softly, its paper brittle at the edges, its photographs faded into sepia, the faces within both familiar and strange. An old album is a fragile vessel, carrying fragments of lives once vivid, now preserved only in silence and shadow. As the page fell flat, another likeness appeared, the image of Enid Lindeman in years, when her beauty was still luminous, but touched now by time, her eyes no longer quite as bright as in youth, yet still steady, still commanding. To look upon such an image is to sense both the persistence of presence and the inevitability of change. For beauty, like roses in a garden, does not vanish at once but softens slowly, each petal loosening until only memory remains. In her later years, Enid moved through society not with the same reckless fire that had defined her youth, but with the seasoned confidence of one who had outlasted her generation. She no longer shocked with the suddenness of her choices, for the world had grown accustomed to her defiance. Instead, she unsettled in a quieter way, by her very endurance. Many of those who had once whispered her name in salons were gone, their voices silenced by time, their judgments dissolved into the earth. Yet Enid remained, a survivor not only of her husbands and her lovers, but of her detractors. She had become, in a sense, the last witness to her own legend, the living embodiment of stories that had outlived their tellers. Her beauty, though altered by age, retained its power, for beauty is not only in youth, but in the way a person carries the marks of life. Lines upon her face spoke of laughter as much as sorrow. Her eyes held a depth that youth cannot know. Her presence carried the authority of survival. Guests who came to see her in those later years often remarked that she seemed larger than life, not because of appearance alone, but because of the aura that surrounded her. the weight of a story that had become inseparable from her person. To sit in her company was to sit not only with a woman, but with history itself, with myth, with the lingering resonance of a life lived boldly. Yet there must have been moments of solitude, of quiet reflection, when the weight of her past pressed more heavily than the admiration of others. One can imagine her seated by a window, an album open on her lap, her fingers resting lightly upon the image of a face long gone, a husband, a friend, perhaps even one of her lovers. Did she feel then the sting of grief, sharpened anew by memory, or had the years dulled it into something softer, more bearable, more contemplative? Did she smile at the recollection of moments once sweet, or did she turn the page quickly, unwilling to linger too long on ghosts? These are the questions that such images ask of us, though they give us no reply. Her legend had by then taken on a life of its own, whispered less as scandal and more as fascination. Younger generations who had never known the salons of her youth or the rumors of her marriages heard the name Lady Kilmore not as accusation, but as myth, a tale of audacity passed down like a story told by candlelight. She became less a figure to fear and more one to marvel at, proof that a woman could live beyond the strictures of her time and yet remain firmly within its memory. And perhaps this transformation brought her a measure of peace, for to be remembered as legend is, in its way, a form of immortality, even if the legend is not wholly kind. Still, time is unrelenting. Her world, once filled with lavish dinners and midnight conversations, grew quieter as friends passed away, as the gatherings thinned, as the old rhythms of society shifted. The Britain she had known, the Britain of empire, of grandeur, of rigid classes and glittering excess, was fading, replaced by something leaner, more austere, less indulgent of scandal and spectacle. She must have felt at times like a relic of another age, a figure out of step with the present, yet too enduring to vanish into the past. Such dissonance can be lonely, for to live beyond one's age is to walk in a space where memory is both anchor and exile. And yet, she endured it with the same poise with which she had endured all else. If her beauty faded, she wore it with dignity. If her influence waned, she replaced it with presence. If her world shifted, she remained herself, unchanged at the core. In this way, she demonstrated that survival is not only a matter of chance, but of will, of refusing to be diminished by what time takes away. She had long practiced the art of reinvention, and in later life, reinvention meant not defiance but acceptance, not spectacle, but endurance. The album lay open, its page turned, its images fading, but still visible. Each photograph was both memory and mirror, showing not only the people within, but the passage of time itself. Enid, gazing upon them, must have felt the strange mixture of sorrow and gratitude that comes with age, the sorrow of loss, the gratitude of endurance. She had lived more fully than most, had suffered more than most, had been judged more harshly than most, and yet she remained. And in that remaining lay her triumph, quiet though it was, understated though it might seem compared to the brilliance of her earlier years. The candle beside her burned low, its flame steady but small, casting a gentle light upon the open page, and as the shadows lengthened across the room, the candle flickered, its wax softening, its glow a reminder that all things, even legends, are bound to mortality. The candle burned lower, its flame steady yet fragile, a small defiance against the lengthening shadows of the room. Wax pooled at its base, silent testimony to the passing of hours, each drop marking time as surely as the ticking of a clock. In its light, faint and flickering, one is reminded of the lives that had touched Enid Lindeman. Lives bright at first, then dimmed, then extinguished, leaving her once more a survivor among ashes. Mortality was not an abstraction for her, but a companion, an unwelcome guest who arrived too often, too early, taking husbands, taking lovers, taking friends, until death itself became woven into the fabric of her story. To speak of Enid is to speak of this shadow, for it followed her as faithfully as her own reflection, shaping both her legend and her solitude. From her earliest widowhood with Rodrik Cameron to the sudden decline of Brigadier Cavendish, from the passing of Duke Furness to the endless whispers that surrounded her, death was always present. It hovered at the edges of her banquets. It lingered in the corridors of her houses. It filled the pauses between laughter and music. And yet, rather than diminish her, it seemed to deepen her presence. Each loss could have broken her, as it broke so many others, but instead it sharpened her defiance, her insistence on living fully, even extravagantly. She wore widowhood not as shroud, but as mantle, and if others recoiled from the frequency of her bereavements, she carried them as proof of her endurance. In this way, mortality became not merely her shadow, but her stage, against which she enacted her most audacious performance: survival. But survival is never without cost. To stand again and again beside coffins, to hear the dull thud of earth falling upon polished wood, to breathe the thick scent of lilies mingled with grief, such moments leave marks that no amount of laughter or jewels can fully conceal. Did she, in the privacy of her chambers, ever feel the weight of this repetition, the cruelty of being left behind so often? Did she ever wonder whether she herself was cursed, whether some unseen hand had marked her life with a pattern she could not escape? Or did she banish such thoughts, refusing to surrender to the superstitions that others so readily attached to her? The truth remains hidden, known only to her, yet the questions persist, echoing softly like the candle's flame against the walls. The shadow of death also shaped her reputation. Society, ever eager for stories that both fascinate and condemn, wove her losses into a narrative of danger. 4 husbands, each gone too soon. Was it chance, or was it something more? The epithet Lady Kilmore carried this suspicion, and though no proof ever existed, the repetition of death made rumor plausible, even irresistible. In this sense, mortality did not merely haunt her privately. It pursued her publicly, attaching itself to her identity until she could not be separated from it. To live beneath such suspicion is to live within a double prison, the grief of true loss and the burden of false accusation. Yet Enid bore both with composure, neither denying nor affirming, allowing the ambiguity to stand. And perhaps this, too, was a kind of triumph, for in refusing to resolve the riddle, she ensured her legend's endurance. There is something profoundly human in her relationship with mortality, for we are all, in the end, defined by our encounters with death. Some resist it by seeking oblivion in distraction, others by clinging to faith, others still by surrendering to despair. Enid chose another path, to confront it by living more vividly, by refusing to bow, by transforming loss into momentum. Each death seemed to push her forward rather than hold her back, as though she drew energy not from denial but from defiance. This defiance unsettled those around her, for it inverted the expected role of a widow who was meant to retreat, to mourn, to accept silence. Instead, Enid expanded, her laughter louder, her presence more dazzling, her appetite for life sharpened. In this inversion lay the seed of both her scandal and her legend, and yet, for all her defiance, the candle reminded her, as it reminds us, that mortality spares no one. The flame burned lower, the wax thinned, the light grew weaker. No matter how brilliantly she lived, no matter how many whispers she defied, time itself moved steadily forward, carrying her closer to her own end. Perhaps she knew this more keenly than most, having witnessed it so often, having stood so close to it in others. Perhaps this knowledge did not frighten her but liberated her, teaching her that life's brevity is what gives it intensity, that the awareness of death is what makes beauty so piercing, love so urgent, freedom so necessary. In this way, the shadow of mortality was not only her adversary but also her teacher, shaping her philosophy, deepening her audacity. One can imagine her in later years, gazing into a candle's flame, her face lit in golden flicker, her eyes steady. Did she see in that flame the faces of her husbands, her lovers, her friends, each one a light extinguished? Did she feel sorrow, or did she feel gratitude that she remained, that she could still breathe, still laugh, still remember? Perhaps both. For memory itself is a kind of survival, allowing the dead to live on in the minds of the living. And Enid, for all her scandal, for all her contradictions, carried with her a vast reservoir of memory, a silent archive of lives entwined with her own. In this, she was not merely survivor, but also vessel, the keeper of stories that would otherwise have been lost. The candle at last bent lower, its flame trembling, its wax nearly gone. Shadows lengthened, soft and unresolved, stretching into corners that no light could reach. And in that deepening darkness, the steady hush of a clock began to make itself known, its ticking slow, deliberate, unrelenting, each beat a reminder that time waits for no one, not even for those who seem larger than life. The hush of the clock echoed in the stillness, each tick a soft insistence, each talk a quiet reminder that time does not pause, not even for those who have long defied its weight. In the twilight of her years, Enid Lindeman, once dazzling in ballrooms and notorious in salons, now sat more often in silence, her world narrowed not by scandal, but by age. The grand rooms of Cliveden, once filled with laughter, debate, and music, grew quieter, the echo of footsteps more sparse, the corridors more solemn. She had outlived so many, husbands, lovers, rivals, friends, that her own endurance became its own form of isolation. To live long is to live with absence, and Enid, who had always moved amidst abundance, now faced the peculiar scarcity that comes not from want, but from loss. Her beauty, once the subject of endless fascination, had softened into the dignity of age. The lines upon her face were written by laughter and grief alike, her hair silvered, her movements slower. Yet she carried herself with the same poise that had always defined her, as though to yield to frailty was beneath her nature. Visitors who came to her in those years often remarked not on decline, but on presence, on the aura that still surrounded her. Even in age, she remained formidable, luminous not with the brilliance of youth, but with the steady glow of endurance. She had become, in a way, a monument to her own story, the living remnant of a world that had otherwise vanished. But monuments are lonely. To be the last bearer of one's legend is to walk in rooms filled more with memory than with company. Enid must have felt this loneliness, though whether she confessed it we cannot know. Did she hear, in the ticking of the clock, the voices of those long gone? Rodrik with his restless charm, Frederick with his stern authority, Duke with his extravagant vitality, Waldorf with his steady permanence. Did she imagine their laughter once more filling the halls, their presence leaning toward her across candle-lit tables? Or did she sit in silence, unwilling to summon ghosts, content to let them rest in memory's depths? The answer remains hidden, like so much of her life, but the possibility lingers in the hush. In these twilight years, her legend weighed upon her differently. The nickname Lady Kilmore, once cruel, then fascinating, now seemed to belong more to history than to her present life. Few still whispered it in malice. Most spoke it as a story from another age, a tale half true, half invented, carried forward more by intrigue than by fact. Enid herself may have regarded it with a kind of weary amusement, knowing that reputations often outlive their accuracy. What mattered now was not the whispers of society, but the persistence of memory, the simple fact that she was still here, still alive, still herself, when so many others were not. In this way, survival became her greatest legacy, a triumph more enduring than scandal. The rhythm of her days grew quieter, mornings in the garden, afternoons by the fire, evenings with books or letters. She no longer danced through salons nor dazzled at dinners, but she did not need to. The vitality she had once expressed through spectacle, she now expressed through presence, the steady assurance of one who had lived fully and now lived reflectively. Guests who visited in those later years found her not diminished, but deepened. Her conversation less sparkling, perhaps, but more contemplative. Her laughter quieter, but more sincere. She had become, in her twilight, not a performer, but a witness. Not a scandal, but a sage. And yet mortality pressed closer. The ticking of the clock, once a distant murmur, now seemed louder, its rhythm more insistent. Each day carried with it the awareness that the end must come, that even the strongest spirit cannot resist forever. Did she fear it, or did she accept it as she had accepted the deaths of others, with composure and defiance? Perhaps both. For death is never wholly feared nor wholly embraced. It is met with the same contradictions that define life itself. Enid, who had always lived within contradiction, may have found in it a familiar companion, one more guest at the table she had long presided over. The quiet of those years was not empty, but full of memory. Each room of Cliveden, each corridor, each garden path carried echoes of the life she had lived, the laughter of dinners, the whispers of gossip, the music of dances, the sorrow of farewells. To walk through them must have been to walk through her own past, to feel it pressing close, not as burden but as testament. Few are granted the chance to live long enough to see their life become legend while they still breathe, but Enid was such a one. She lived to see herself remembered, to hear her own story told in drawing rooms, to witness her name carried forward even as her body grew frail. In this, she achieved a kind of immortality before death, a rare and strange privilege. The clock ticked still, its sound steady, unyielding as shadows lengthened across the room. Outside, the garden lay hushed, the roses bowed beneath evening dew, the river gliding silently past. Within, Enid sat, luminous in her solitude, her eyes steady even as time pressed close. She had lived boldly, survived scandal, outlasted whispers, endured loss. Now, in the twilight of her years, she faced only the final inevitability, with the same poise she had shown in all else. The hush deepened, the clock ticking softly, and in that silence one could almost hear the unfinished sentences of memory, voices trailing off into shadows. The sound lingered unresolved, like words half-spoken, leading toward the final chapters of her story, where truth and myth would blur once more, and where the turning of time would yield at last to the final quiet. The hush of the clock lingered, its ticking soft as unfinished sentences, as though memory itself had paused midway, uncertain how best to continue. In that uncertainty lies the question that shadows every life. How will one be remembered? For Enid Lindeman, whose days had stretched across scandal and splendor, whose nights had been lit by both laughter and suspicion, this question was not idle. She had lived long enough to hear her own legend take form, long enough to watch others speak of her as though she were already a figure of history, rather than a woman of flesh and breath. And in that strange position, poised between life and remembrance, she became a witness to the ways in which reputation is shaped, not by truth alone, but by perception, by envy, by desire, and by fear. History has seldom been kind to women who live as Enid lived, to claim freedom, to embrace desire, to move with audacity in spaces where one is expected to obey, is to invite not only attention, but distortion. Men who live boldly are admired. Women who do the same are often condemned, reduced to caricature, their complexity flattened into cautionary tale. Enid knew this. She must have felt it in every whisper, in every nickname, in every article that spoke her name with insinuation. Lady Kilmore. The title that clung to her like smoke, reducing her story to a single suggestion, as though her life could be explained only through suspicion. And yet, even in this distortion, she found endurance, for the name, however cruel, ensured she would not be forgotten. The paradox of her remembrance lies here. She is remembered not despite scandal, but because of it. Not despite contradiction, but because she embodied it so completely. To tell her story truthfully is to resist the temptation of simplification, to refuse to pin her down as merely seductress or merely victim. She was both and neither. She was generous and reckless, loyal and unfaithful, radiant and shadowed, fragile and indomitable. She contained multitudes, and it is precisely this that made her unforgettable. History, however, prefers neatness, and so it seizes upon the most convenient symbol, Lady Kilmore, the widow whose husbands died too soon, the woman whose presence seemed always entwined with death. This symbol is not false, but it is incomplete, and in its incompleteness it does both injustice and honor, diminishing her humanity while preserving her immortality. The question arises, is it better to be remembered falsely than to be forgotten truly? Enid may have asked herself this in moments of solitude, though whether she found comfort in the thought we cannot know. Perhaps she accepted that distortion was the price of endurance, that myth was the only guarantee against oblivion. If so, then she was wise. For history does not preserve truth with purity. It preserves impressions, echoes, fragments woven into stories that reflect as much of the teller as of the subject. In becoming myth, Enid transcended the fragility of fact. She became, instead, a riddle. And riddles endure where simple answers fade. There is also the question of gender, for the lens through which her life was viewed was never neutral. A man with 4 wives who each died prematurely might have been pitied, even admired for his endurance. A woman with 4 dead husbands was condemned, suspected, named dangerous. A man with countless lovers might have been praised for virility. A woman with the same was whispered about with disdain. Enid's story reveals this double standard with stark clarity, and in this sense her legend is not merely personal, but emblematic. She became the screen upon which society projected its anxieties about female freedom, its fears of women who refused to remain contained. To call her Lady Kilmore was to warn others. This is what happens when women live too boldly. Yet in embodying this warning, she also embodied resistance, for she lived it nonetheless, unbroken, unbowed. In the quiet of her later years, she must have sensed that her story would outlive her, though not in the form she might have chosen. Did this knowledge weigh heavily upon her, or did it bring a certain peace? Perhaps she found solace in knowing that the details of her life, however distorted, would continue to echo in halls far removed from her own. Perhaps she even smiled at the thought that long after her voice had fallen silent, others would still debate her, still puzzle over her, still ask whether she was cursed, cruel, or simply free. To provoke questions beyond one's lifetime is no small achievement, and in this, she triumphed. The unfinished sentences of memory stretched further. the clock ticking on, its rhythm both relentless and soothing. And in that rhythm, one hears the broader truth, that history itself is a series of unfinished sentences, stories half told, never complete. Enid's life reminds us of this, for it resists finality, resists conclusion. Every attempt to define her dissolves into ambiguity. Every effort to judge her raises further questions. Was she victim or villain, saint or sinner, free spirit or manipulator? The answer is always yes and no, always both and neither. She was human, and humanity does not yield to easy categories. The page of the album remained open still, her likeness faded yet persistent. Outside, the world continued, indifferent to legend, indifferent to reputation, indifferent to the unfinished sentences of memory. And yet, within the quiet, her presence lingered, not as clear truth, but as enduring enigma. The torn page of history remained where it was, the sentence half written, waiting for someone to continue, waiting for someone to interpret, waiting for someone to ask again the questions she herself may never have answered. And as the hush of the clock deepened into silence, voices seemed to murmur faintly beyond the edge of hearing. Not the whispers of gossip this time, but the murmurs of memory itself, repeating her name, reshaping it, carrying it forward into the next chapter, where legend would harden further into myth. The murmurs of memory rose faintly, like voices carried from a distance, indistinct yet insistent, repeating her name as though unwilling to let it fade. Names are curious things. They cling more tightly than flesh. They outlast bodies and dwellings. They echo long after laughter and footsteps have ceased. For Enid Lindeman, it was not merely her given name that endured, but the one imposed upon her, the one that both diminished and exalted her, Lady Kilmore. Spoken first in jest, then in suspicion, later in fascination, it became inseparable from her story. A shadow that followed her in life and lingered still after her death. Though she lived a life of many parts, wife, widow, hostess, lover, it was this single epithet that hardened into memory, a distillation of rumor and myth that history would not relinquish. Why did it endure? Perhaps because it was simple, sharp, unforgettable, the kind of name that carries easily across rooms and across generations. It reduced the complexity of her life into a single phrase, and in that reduction lay its power. To say Lady Kilmore was to evoke scandal, death, beauty, danger, all at once without explanation. It was story and accusation bound together, and stories, especially those tinged with darkness, travel farther than truth. Long after her contemporaries had passed, long after the rooms of Cliveden had emptied of their original laughter, the name still stirred curiosity, still provoked unease. It had become not only her reputation but her legend, carved into the imagination of those who never met her. And yet to consider the endurance of this name is also to consider the injustice it carried. For behind Lady Kilmore was Enid, a woman of contradictions and depths, of courage and longing, of choices both reckless and deliberate. The name flattened her, stripping away nuance, leaving only suspicion. It preserved her while distorting her, ensuring remembrance while denying understanding. Was this a curse or a triumph? Perhaps it was both. To be remembered falsely is painful, but to be forgotten truly is a greater loss. Enid, who had lived her life with defiance, may well have preferred distortion to oblivion, scandal to silence. And if so, then the endurance of Lady Kilmore was not defeat, but victory, for it meant she had carved her mark upon history in a way that could not be erased. The voices that murmured her name after her passing were not the same as those who had whispered it during her life. In salons and drawing rooms of later years, the name was spoken less with malice than with fascination, less as condemnation than as curiosity. Who was this woman, they asked, who had married 4 men of wealth and buried 3 of them, who had presided over Cliveden with wit and audacity, who had defied expectation and left behind a trail of rumor? Was she truly dangerous or merely misunderstood? Did she bring death or did she simply survive it? Each retelling offered a different answer, and in the ambiguity her legend grew. For legends thrive not on certainty but on questions, not on clarity but on the fog that allows imagination to wander. Even in literature and recollections of society, her name resurfaced, invoked as symbol rather than as person. She became shorthand for scandal, for danger cloaked in beauty, for the power of a woman who refused to bow. And yet beneath this symbol lay the softer truth that rarely reached the surface. Her generosity, her intelligence, her capacity for loyalty, her moments of vulnerability. These qualities, too, were real, but they were less convenient for myth-making, less suited to the sharpness of a nickname, and so they faded from common memory, though perhaps they linger still in the private recollections of those few who truly knew her. It is worth reflecting on how names, once given, escape the control of those who bear them. Enid did not choose Lady Kilmore, but once it was spoken, it belonged less to her than to those who repeated it. In their mouths it shaped her destiny, defined her reputation, ensured her immortality. Yet names are not static. They change with time, carrying different shades in different eras. What was once condemnation became fascination. What was once fear became myth. And perhaps this transformation is its own justice, for it allows us to see not only the cruelty of gossip, but also the persistence of legend. Enid's name survived not because of truth, but because of the irresistible allure of a story that would not die. The persistence of Lady Kilmore also reveals something about the society that created it. It reveals its fear of women who live too freely, its suspicion of female desire, its discomfort with those who refuse to remain within the lines. By naming her thus, society sought to contain her, to explain her, to turn her life into a cautionary tale. Yet in so doing, it only magnified her, only ensured that her story would travel farther than theirs. In attempting to diminish her, they preserved her, and in this paradox she triumphed. She became the very thing they feared most, unforgettable. Still, the endurance of her nickname carries sadness, for beneath the legend was a woman who laughed, who wept, who loved, who suffered, who lived with the same contradictions as us all. To remember her only as Lady Kilmore is to forget Enid, the girl who once gazed across the sea from Australia, restless for the world beyond. It is to forget the woman who walked through Cliveden's gardens at dawn, who spoke with wit at dinners, who endured loss with composure. It is to forget that scandal was not the whole of her, but only one thread in the tapestry. And yet, perhaps she herself understood that history would not preserve her fully, that only fragments would remain, that myth would outlast truth. And perhaps she accepted this with the same poise with which she accepted all else. The murmurs of her name continued, fading and returning, never fully silenced. They drifted like voices in another room, half heard, half imagined, carrying her legend into places she never walked, into ears she never met. And as they faded into the distance, another sound arose, softer still, the murmur of waves upon a shoreline, water rising and falling, washing away footprints even as it revealed new patterns in the sand. The murmur of waves upon the shoreline rose and fell, steady as breath, dissolving footprints into patterns no one could claim as their own. It is the nature of water to erase and to renew, to carry away what was written upon sand and to replace it with shifting forms that change with each tide. So too does time wash over human lives, softening their outlines, blurring their distinctions, leaving behind not the exact details, but the enduring shapes of meaning. In the story of Enid Lindeman, what remains most clearly are not the precise facts of each marriage or each rumor, but the larger themes that defined her existence: desire and freedom, wealth and mortality, survival and scandal. These are the tides that carried her, the tides that continue to draw us toward her legend, as though in her story we glimpse not only her life, but our own unspoken longings. Desire was the current that moved most visibly through her days. It was desire that drew her from Australia's distant shores into the heart of British society. Desire that bound her to men of wealth and power, desire that led her into affairs that unsettled and fascinated those around her. Yet desire, for her, was never merely physical. It was the desire for life itself, for intensity, for experience beyond the narrow boundaries offered to women of her age. She sought not only lovers but vitality, not only companionship but freedom from the silence imposed upon her sex. In this, she embodied the truth that desire is not shameful but essential, the force that propels us toward connection, toward expression, toward the fullness of being alive. That society condemned her for it says more of their fear than of her fault. Freedom was her true pursuit, and scandal was merely its shadow. She lived not as she was told, but as she chose, and in this lay her audacity. To marry 4 times, to take lovers, to host without apology, to laugh in the face of gossip, these were all expressions of a single refusal, the refusal to be contained. For women of her station, freedom was seldom granted, and so she took it for herself, knowing well the cost. Each whisper, each nickname, each suspicion was the price she paid, and she paid it willingly, for to her, the cage was worse than the slander. In her defiance, we see both courage and solitude, for freedom often isolates, yet without it, life becomes mere endurance. Enid lived not to endure, but to defy, and in this she remains luminous. Wealth surrounded her always, yet it was both gift and burden. It gave her access to salons, to estates, to the power of hosting and influencing. It allowed her to dazzle in jewels, to adorn herself in silks, to preside over Cliveden as if it were her natural kingdom. But wealth also attracted suspicion, envy, and dependence. Each husband's fortune, each inheritance, became part of the story told against her, as though her survival could be explained only through calculation. Did she pursue wealth deliberately, or did it pursue her? Perhaps both. For wealth and scandal often entwine, and she, who lived amidst both, understood their entanglement better than most. Yet to see her only through the lens of wealth is to miss the truth that she wore it lightly, as stage setting rather than as substance. Wealth gave her means, but freedom remained her aim. Mortality, however, was the tide that returned most insistently. From the first death she witnessed to the last, it shaped her story more deeply than any jewel or gown. Husbands lost, lovers gone, friends buried, these became the refrain of her life, the recurring shadow that others turned into suspicion. And yet, if death surrounded her, it never defeated her. She stood again and again, luminous against loss, turning each funeral into prelude for new vitality. In this, she reminds us of the paradox of mortality, that it diminishes and enriches at once, robbing us of companionship but sharpening our sense of life. Enid, who outlived so many, must have felt this paradox keenly, and perhaps it was this that gave her laughter its depth, her presence its intensity, her defiance its necessity. Mortality haunted her, but it also made her immortal. Survival was, in the end, her greatest accomplishment, not wealth, not scandal, not beauty, but the simple fact of endurance. Endurance through loss, through gossip, through time. She survived where others faltered, not unscathed but unbroken, carrying forward her legend until it hardened into history. To survive is not glamorous, yet it is profound, for it is survival that allows memory to take shape, that allows stories to be told. Enid's survival was not passive but active, a deliberate choice to continue, to shine, to laugh, even when silence pressed close. In this, she was not only survivor but teacher, though she never said herself as such. She showed, simply by living, that endurance can itself be brilliance. And then there is Scandal, the most enduring shadow of her life. Scandal shaped her legend, but it also concealed her truth. It fascinated because it was simpler than her complexity, easier to repeat than her contradictions. Scandal made her memorable, but it also made her misunderstood. Yet Scandal, too, reveals something universal, for it is the mirror of society's own fears and desires. To condemn her was to conceal longing. To whisper about her was to confess fascination. In this way, Scandal was not only her burden, but also her gift to others, allowing them to confront in her story the contradictions they could not face in themselves. And perhaps this is why her legend persists, because it speaks not only of her, but of us, of the ways we live between desire and fear, freedom and judgment, life and death. The waves upon the shoreline murmured still, rising and falling, erasing and renewing. They carried away footprints yet revealed patterns no less real, patterns shaped by tide and by time. Enid's story, too, is such a pattern, not fixed, not clear, but enduring, shifting, shimmering. To seek certainty in it is to miss its essence, for its truth lies not in conclusions but in questions, not in clarity but in ambiguity. She was many things. She was contradictory. She was luminous. She was shadowed. And in this, she was profoundly human, though remembered as myth. The waves receded once more, their murmur fading into the distance, leaving behind only silence, wide and soft, broken faintly by the flicker of a lone light in a distant window, waiting to guide the listener into the story's final quiet. The lone light flickered in the distant window, steady yet wavering, a small beacon against the wide hush of night. Its glow was faint, but in the darkness, even faint light becomes meaningful, a reminder that presence endures even as silence deepens. So it was with the memory of Enid Lindeman, who, long after her footsteps ceased, continued to cast her glow across the imagination of those who spoke her name. She had lived as few dared to live, with audacity and freedom, with laughter and scandal, with beauty and sorrow entwined. Now her story, like the flickering of that light, remained not as certainty, but as suggestion, inviting reflection more than conclusion, leaving behind a riddle rather than a resolution. Her life cannot be reduced to the number of her husbands, nor to the sharpness of her nickname, nor to the wealth and splendor of Cliveden. These are details, yes, but they are not the whole. The whole lies in the way she inhabited each moment, refusing to be contained by the narrow expectations placed upon her, choosing instead to live with the fullness of desire, the boldness of defiance, the dignity of survival. Whether she was saint or sinner, manipulator or victim, was never the true question. The true question is what her life reveals about the nature of freedom, of mortality, of the ways in which we seek to shape our destinies even as time shapes us in return. In her, we glimpse the paradox of human longing. We long for love, yet we fear loss. We long for freedom, yet we dread judgment. We long for immortality, yet we live beneath the shadow of death. Enid embodied these paradoxes openly, visibly, scandalously, in a way that unsettled those who preferred to keep them hidden. This is why she fascinated, why she disturbed, why she remains unforgettable. To speak of her is to confront our own contradictions, to recognize in her story the reflection of our own restless desires. She became a vessel for projection, carrying not only her own truth, but the unspoken truths of those who whispered her name. The light in the window wavered once more, its flame bending but not extinguished. In it, one sees the persistence of legend, fragile yet enduring, flickering yet steady. Enid's legend, too, persists, not always kind, not always fair, but enduring nonetheless. Lady Kilmore, they still say, though often now with a smile of curiosity rather than condemnation. The name has outlived the malice that birthed it, transformed into myth, into symbol, into story. And perhaps this transformation is her final triumph. For though she was judged, she was not erased. Though she was misunderstood, she was not forgotten. To remain in memory is in the end a form of victory, however imperfect. One imagines her, in her final days, sitting quietly as the evening deepened, her body frailer, her beauty softened, her eyes still steady. Did she look back upon her life with pride, with regret, with amusement? Did she smile at the thought of how she would be remembered, or did she sigh at the injustice of it? We cannot know. Perhaps she did all these things, for contradiction had always been her companion. What we do know is that she faced the end as she had faced all else, with composure, with resilience, with a presence that could not be diminished by time. In this, she remained true to herself, consistent even in finality. And so her story closes not with certainty, but with ambiguity, not with a moral neatly drawn, but with a lingering image, a woman who walked boldly through life, who loved and lost, who defied and endured, who became legend by refusing to be ordinary. She leaves us with questions, with reflections, with the uneasy awareness that freedom is never simple, that desire is never without cost, that survival is both triumph and solitude. In this way, she continues to speak, not in words but in silence, not in answers but in the questions she provokes. The light in the window flickered one last time, then steadied, its glow faint but unyielding. Outside, the night deepened, the air hushed, the world settling into rest. And within that hush, her story too came to its close, not extinguished, but lingering, like a fragrance in an empty room, like a melody remembered long after the musicians have departed. She remains, in memory and in myth, a presence unresolved, a figure luminous and shadowed, a life scandalous and contemplative. She remains, above all, unforgettable. And now, as the last words fade into quiet, let the listener rest as well, carried gently by the rhythm of her story, drawn into silence, into stillness, into sleep.